Welcome to this week's podcast. I'm with Brian Krogsgaard of Post Status, and today we're just going to catch up and talk about all things awesome.
All things awesome. Hey, thanks for having me, Josh.
Hey, thank you, Brian. You've interviewed me 3 or 4 or 5 times, and I figure it's my turn to return the favor. And I'll be straight with you. I'm a really big fan of your work. The work that you write at Post Status, the community you curate, the podcast that you've done. You've been in this WordPress industry, 8, 9, 10 years now?
I've been actively in the space since 2010 was when I started blogging about WordPress. I was introduced to WordPress more like 07, 08 when I was trying to figure out how to build websites.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So you've seen the rise of the beast, and you've
yes. All the way since well below 10% of market share. So we've more than quadrupled market share since I've been involved in WordPress. Maybe that's how we should measure how WordPress OG are you? What percentage of the web was WordPress whenever you got involved?
What if we did it backwards and said WordPress has 3 Krogsgaard careers worth of market share?
There you go. That works.
Make your career the unit of measurement.
Yeah.
Give me your 2 cents. What's going on in the marketplace in this ecosystem right now? What's interesting to you?
Oh man, there's so much stuff that I might as well use this as my draft for my big ideas. But there's a lot of things that I think are pretty consistent in the market right now. I mean, you're in the hosting industry. You're seeing a good bit of what I'm probably thinking, but there's another element of it. I think hosting is representative of it, but you're seeing consolidation, which is a theme that I talked about in 2017 to be on the lookout for.
Yep.
In fact, back in, I don't remember which Pressnomics you gave me a platform for, but it was one of them. It was the first time I did kind of a business of WordPress type of big fat overview. And then I did it again about a year later. And some of those themes have definitely come true. Some of the opportunities are still out there, which is interesting. But that big theme of consolidation has definitely been super thorough. And across kind of all fronts, we've seen big hosts gobble up smaller hosts. That's not just a WordPress thing though. That's like a business thing, but you're seeing you're seeing the medium and small WordPress hosts start to say, hey, what's my angle out? Like, what's my game plan for when this is all done? You're seeing the bigger hosts either point towards an IPO or private equity, things like that, which is their own type of exit and consolidation. People don't think of an IPO as an exit, but it is. Like, that's the opportunity for the primary shareholders to take some off the table. And that works its way all the way down, in my mind, to people who are historically freelancers, able to, churn and burn client work, contract work. And I think more of those folks are seeking the comfort of full-time work and a different pace, a different stress level. And I think they're finding that under the umbrellas of large plug-in companies, many of which are making the move towards SaaS, where selling software one time is not cutting it anymore, and also towards large consulting companies that are primarily maintenance driven or like retainer based, and large hosting companies who are trying to pull in the various bifurcated experiences of WordPress onto one umbrella so that the large host X or large host Y experiences are kind of all encompassing within their own ecosystem.
Yeah, a lot of walled gardens.
A lot of walled gardens. And so that's the kind of the 3 levels I would point towards. And what you're seeing squeezed there, in my mind, is I think you're seeing the middle market developer, like the self-supported, talented freelancer. You're seeing them get squeezed out a bit because the market for saying, hey, I want you to build, 7 or 8, $15,000 to $30,000 websites in a year maybe with some contract partnerships or whatever. You earn yourself a 6-figure living, and it's nice. That's a harder route to go these days because it's that middle zone. And I don't say that as in a $15,000 website's cheap, but
Mm-hmm.
now people are getting $2,000 websites that look a lot like those $15,000 and $20,000 websites, and they're done by site wranglers or someone in their second career or doing it on the side for a hustle, or they're able to pump out 100 of these a year or something. And then you go the other route, which is the human maids and the 10-ups and the modern tribes, where they're not hardly looking at anything that's under 6 figures. And they have a lot of 7-figure clients that are carrying large portions of their staff to be able to create seamlessness in their payroll processes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what gets lost are the smaller companies, like the niche web development agency that does higher end work, or the talented freelancer. I think it's just easier for them to do other things, or to like subspecialize and go even more narrow for what they're seeking, rather than selling a website to someone that comes after them to kind of provide the whole development experience. That was a long answer, so I apologize. But that's the types of consolidation that I'm seeing.
Yeah, so certainly the market changes as it matures. Things are going to happen. Some work that was there before is going to dry up, and market pressures are going to drive customer bases in certain directions. Do you think this is a good thing? And I know that answer depends on which stakeholder you are. It's a good thing for a big conglomerate to wrap up a bunch of small competitors, obviously. So take it from the view of a couple stakeholders, say, a big dog, a small dog, and then like the platform. Like what's the platform is a stakeholder too, WordPress itself.
Yeah, I think there are dangers for the platform. I'll lead with that. Let me express someone that I think it's really good for, and I'll use a pretty thorough example. So like Yoast is a great example of a company that I think really benefits in this scenario because they're able to hire people. They have the scale of WordPress, this large percentage of the internet, services that they could provide that are a value add, but obviously not a core experience. So they're not going to get gobbled up into the platform itself. They're really outside the scope of what any hosting company would think is reasonable. It's just a really nice fit for kind of a product plus service in some ways, where they can scale nicely and people can come in under that Yoast umbrella and they can grow to be a really nice, sustainable, scalable company. I think that's great. That's what we want. That's what we would dream of in 2012, And the other side of that is I think, not everybody wants to go work for a 100-person consulting agency, but it's harder now to be part of a 3-person or a 5-person agency. I've seen some of the best overall full product design dev agencies that are 2 or 3 people. I've seen some of them just not be able to make it because people don't want to go to them and say, we're going to give you this large amount of money, when they can go to somebody that they kind of know they're going to get the job done. There's not the risks, the same type of freelancer risks that they still see with a 2 or 3-person agency. I think it's really hard to be in that line of business. I don't think that's a very good thing. I also think we had this path where it was like, I'm interested in WordPress. I like WordPress, and it's really easy to pick up freelance work that's independent. Now, most of the time, if you're going to do freelance work, you're going to do it contractually through one of these larger agencies that's using freelancers to kind of scale up with seasonality or something. And I don't like that as much because it's a little harder for that person who's an entrepreneur to take that and turn it into their own business because you don't have this pipeline of work that's independently developed. Some of those types of challenges. So I don't think that's as good. And then for the platform itself, I think the developer interest and the developer community has got to be strong. And in some ways, we've upped the requirements from a development perspective. We've said, hey, you got to be a pro JavaScript person at the server level. So, like interfacing with complex frameworks, whether it's React and Vue and Backbone and all these tools that we have built into WordPress now and built into the majority of the plugins. And really, you don't need a lot of that entry-level code where you were going in and taking a theme, ripping it apart, putting it back together, teaching yourself how to do things, but you're not breaking anything pivotal.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's mostly the display portion of a website. Now we're doing most of that through page builders and stuff that's more Wrangler-ish. And
Yeah.
I think you're not building up the developer community like we did in 2004 to 2010 or so. And I think that limits our pipeline. And a lot of that interest, the people, the true indie hacker type, they're not coming into the WordPress landscape. People that are coming into the WordPress landscape, maybe they're a DIYer, or if they're a developer, they're coming because they have one of those in-demand skills. Maybe they're a React developer, and there's a lot of business in the WordPress landscape because WordPress is a big ecosystem, but they're not like learning here. They're not
Yeah.
growing up here the way they did at one time. And I think
It's
that that's a risk for the platform.
so the analogy that comes to mind is kind of like populations in developing countries. Like if you look at the population of up and coming country, the age is like a pyramid. You got some old people and then really fat group of youth coming up. Where if you look at the population graph of like Japan, it's an inverted triangle. You have a lot of old people and not as many new people coming up. So if that analogy applies, you're saying there's this like baby boomer middle area of a lot of developers in WordPress, but there's not a bunch of new births happening below it.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe, Josh, our generation, you're a little ahead of me, but we're the boomers of WordPress.
Okay. Yeah. So the ecosystem's certainly changing. You're seeing it in your day-to-day work. I think everybody's kind of experiencing it in their own way, depending on what industry or segment of the industry they're in. Do you think it's going to end well? I mean, if you had to look out 5 years, the continuing consolidation of things, do you think that's a net positive or?
I think it's a natural evolution in a lot of ways. And I think that there's an opportunity for some of that developer interest. And I'm really focusing on one core component of stakeholder, which is not fair. There's a lot of new stakeholders that can benefit in a great way. But I think that it can move towards other things. Like I think the opportunities with WordPress and e-commerce are still gigantic. And there's a lot that people can do, entrepreneurs can do in that landscape. I think there's some risks, I guess, for whether it's a net positive. I think from a business perspective, I think WordPress will continue to be a tool that a lot of corporations like, that it's part of what they have in their line of business.
Mm-hmm.
I think a GoDaddy, as an example, they're not really a competitor of yours, but they're in your realm. They probably look at, hey, we've got all these people that want WordPress and they self-host it. And you know what? We're really good at offering cheap self-hosting for people. And we can build some tools on it to make it a little easier. That's good for GoDaddy's bottom line. That adds a lane for them to have revenue that's somewhat independent of, their domain services or whatever else they do that makes money. Yeah. And I think from a business perspective that can be pretty good. I talked to Matt Mullenweg about this at one point, but I think one of the risks that we run as people do try to like professionalize what they're doing is there's fewer like free and available fully featured tools. And it's like, well, everybody's got to have a monetization angle to be able to sustain it. That wasn't always the case in the land of WordPress. Like there were things that just existed and they were awesome, fully featured. Take WPCLI, for example, open source even. And I think oftentimes now we approach something and we're like, yeah, but how is this going to be sustained? And if those can't be sustained by their own business model, and even if they are, now you're kind of you're going this onesie twosie route of charging people left and right for all kinds of stuff. So you end up paying thousands of dollars a year for your website and dev tools and stuff. Or those have to be sustained by, benevolent benefactors. Like Pagely has to say, you know what, we'd spend $10,000 a year supporting WPCLI because we use WPCLI. Yeah. And that corporate benefactor model, it's got pros and cons too, but a lot of it's cons because you don't know when that can go away, and some of those types of things.
Well, and Daniel, the original author of WPCLI. That's exactly what he did. We contributed, as some other hosts contributed, and I don't know, maybe that gave him about 8 or 9 months worth of runway
Runway.
to build out the stuff. But then he got tired and he just got over it, and he didn't want to have to come back and keep shaking down or asking for more corporate sponsorship. So it sounds like what you're saying is, yes, in the early days, it was easy and free, and people would kind of do it out of love, out of passion, and like, oh, look at this cool thing I made, and it get adopted and get popular. But then quickly reality sets in. It's like, okay, I got a plugin with 10 million installs, and no one's paying me a damn thing to care about it, and I got to put food on the table. And so the knee-jerk reaction now today is, okay, we have to charge for everything. We're not even going to start something unless we know how it's going to put food on our table. So, I could, if that trend persists, I could certainly see it kind of drying out the talent pool and the product pool at the low end in the whole ecosystem. Before you know it, we're going to be Salesforce, and everything's like $100,000 integration just to add a button,
Yeah. And in that scenario, you're never going to get away from the corporate ownership. Everybody will think of WordPress and they'll think, oh, well, WordPress is either Automatic or GoDaddy or EIG, or like these people that are basically funding every component of it, or Google, like they're bigger and bigger in the landscape. I want us to hint on one thing I think is that there's tons of opportunity, and there's a lot of people in this ecosystem that are now really good with WordPress stuff, building stuff with WordPress that we've always just built for other people.
Yeah.
And you don't just have to choose the path of build the tool or do the consulting or, do the picks and shovels side of things. You can also be the explorer. You can take these skills that you have and go use it to build a business or a service. And I think that's what we'll see is people realize, you know what, I have the talents between development and design and marketing and communications and all these things that are part of building a business. And now I can go build a business. I can, no matter what it is. And I've long advocated for people to say, go build the WordPress.com for a particular niche for the construction business. Like
on that note,
really nail it with construction businesses.
Yeah. On that note, I see that being even more likely if the headlines of a impending recession play true. We started Pagely in 2009, 2008. We all remember the economy back then. And it was not necessarily me saying, wow, I have this great idea that I think is going to be very profitable and the world needs it. It was me saying, I got to eat. I better think of something. I'm running out of contracts. There's not the work that there used to be. What skill sets do I possess that I can try to make a business out of? So from that, not scarcity, but, from that lull in an economy, people get more creative on what can I build, what can I create that can get me out of this position I'm in financially.
Yes, it's the need to hustle. A recession forces organizations who typically have large payrolls and whatnot, they trim the fat. Many of us came into our careers or were early enough in our careers where the recession provided some uncertainty for sure, because you don't know if you're going to get a job. I had friends who, they lost their job before they started it because they graduated in 2008, and like the job they had secured, they told them no. And there many people in WordPress, they were around that same zone too. So then they say, okay, well, how can I go make some money? And like, you could do the gig economy route now, I guess. It's going to be a little less profitable. It's like you're basically a commodity. But if you can take skills and then you see a ripe opportunity of this emergence of the web, and whatever is the ripe opportunity, the next recession, you create the next line of entrepreneurs through hard times like that. You don't just go make incredible businesses because it's like a great time for the economy. That's when stupid businesses get made.
Exactly.
That's when stationary bikes with iPads try to IPO with like $1 zillion of losses every year.
We'll put it in the show notes, but there's a Twitter thread I saw where a guy was making like BS Peloton ads, and he was like critiquing every photo. He's like, And I took my Peloton and built a $9,000 solid oak framed stand
Yeah.
for it in front of my beautiful window looking out over my cactus garden. Like
Yeah, it's a great thread.
it's silly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
And I
hey,
think there will be opportunities, I guess, is the point. And people in our landscape, they're web developers, they're application developers, they're expert marketers. They'll be able to take those skills and build something. I think that's where some of the great opportunity we have in our space lies.
gotcha. So,
WordPress as that application framework and as that base layer tool for your business that you make. But you got to be good at something else too, Like it
yeah.
can't just be the tech. You got to find an area that's ripe. The economy doesn't disappear in a recession. It just is harder to make the buck.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you look in your tool belt, figure out what you can build with that tool set, and hopefully something works out for you and you ride the wave back up. I mean,
That's right.
it's essentially what I did to some
Yeah.
degree.
Y'all absolutely did. I mean, you converted the consulting business into a hosting business, but it was the same thing. You took the skills that you had and you put it into a business that could have some monthly recurring revenue. And then when the economy moves back to an expansion phase, you're taking advantage of that the whole way up.
Wow, I wish I would have had this conversation with you 10 years ago and knew what to do ahead of,
Well,
had
we
some
act like another
forethought.
recession is imminent, and it's really hard to call these
Yeah,
things. But
exactly.
I think it's a lot of people would say like we are mid to late cycle.
Mhm.
I mean, you can't not be. It's been 10 years of an expanding economy.
So let me shift gears just a little bit. I've been seeing a lot of momentum, and maybe it's just because I'm looking for it, right? Because of our new product line, I'm kind of looking in lanes next to WordPress, and it seems like Gatsby and some of the other JavaScript frameworks and static sites, but not necessarily them in a vacuum, not Gatsby by itself, but how it works with a content management system behind it, a WordPress or a Contently or something like that. What are you seeing kind of as an opportunity in that kind of what I think may be the next couple year arc?
I think it's really interesting. I think I definitely think there's a lot going on there, and I think it's purely because people are wanting to explore developing with those tools that are in vogue, but in vogue for a reason, because there are some inherent advantages from a developer perspective, or performance perspective, a security perspective, and people are exploring that, and that's great. The danger is if WordPress can't adapt, if there are better tools, if there are things like eventually you just squeeze WordPress out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because people say, you know what, we don't need the templating engine, or you know what, we don't need some of these dynamic components, or we just want to turn stuff on or off as we want. We don't want all of this right out of the box. Well, we need to adapt to, if we want to be the application framework, we need to be able to adapt to enable people to use WordPress as a quick plug and play tool so that someone can get things like really structured taxonomies in their content management system, or user systems for authentication, or whatever like things they need inside their application. And I think we're at risk of losing the benefits there, other than the fact that WordPress is so ubiquitous for websites. Because when I look at which tools are serving that need well, I would look at like a Laravel or something that to me feels like WordPress felt when WordPress was 3 or 4% of the web.
Yeah.
In terms of the way people kind of hack around it and use it for those like easy to plug and play things. But they're using it for applications. They're not using it just for how do I build my blog or my corporate website.
Yeah, there's all this history inside of WordPress on what it was, what it wants to be, what it's been used for, and whether that legacy is as valuable in 5 years from now as it is today, or if that legacy needs to be smashed up and reconfigured into something that is valuable in 5 years. That'll be very interesting to kind of see this art, to see how it plays.
Yeah, I mean, if think about what is WordPress in the first place, right? It's an interface between an administrative view, a database, and a presentation layer.
Mm-hmm.
And when you try to think which of these is WordPress particularly good at, it can be pretty good at all of them, but and pretty much any one of them, you can point to half a dozen other tools that are quite a bit better.
Yeah.
But if you want to use WordPress all in one, you can get a lot done for a very small amount of money. The more and more you want to cater it very specifically, the harder it gets. And that's our great challenge to me, is because I think it should be much easier to cater it very specifically. Whether that's defining the way content is structured. Like WooCommerce, for example, great tool, but it is totally hamstrung by the fact that it's built into the posts table. You know, like people are like querying, you know, price and order data and all this crap out of the meta table that's supposed to just be like fun little notes attached to a blog post. And we're not approaching the architecture of the database to create this dynamic relational situation to do that from core, like not to do it in core, but to make it possible from core in a very easy, straightforward way, to then you can interface with the framework as a whole altogether to where it all just works well. We're not really accounting for that very well. We're still trying to squeeze things into the little tables that exist and the architecture relationships that exist. And we're trying to say, you know what, every WordPress site needs pages, it needs comments, it needs a blog, it needs attachments with attachment views. Like, why do we even have those? Why? There's an attachment page in WordPress, and like you go to it and it's just a picture with a comment box, and it's like, what the heck is this? Literally nobody wants that, but that's default out of WordPress.
And every theme you build, that's the last, you don't think about that view until it shows up in the Google result, and you're like, oh wow, nobody styled that page.
That was always my number one trick whenever I was reviewing other people's like theme work that I worked with. I always hit those dumb URLs that we have in WordPress, and I'm like, did you pay attention to this, or did you hack it to make it look good on that one view of template? Like, what's your default look if I go hit, you know, some random archive that nobody thinks about?
Yeah, don't do that on Pagely. So, you know, I remember that whole conversation about the database architecture, because in the 2007, 8, 9 era, there was a few plugins that were creating custom tables inside the database. And then there was the argument of like, well, if you store your data in that table and then you change plugins, or if you delete the plugin, now you got all this bloat in the database. So the WordPress way became everything goes in the standard table set. And that was the worst decision, I think, that could have been made in terms of the extensibility and the scalability of WordPress. And
I deserve to be called out on this too, because I helped perpetuate that being the WordPress way. I'm to blame for some of that, at least from a like dogma stance. I can explain why if you want to have that conversation.
Something you just said really struck with me. Dogma. So much of our existence in this community is around dogma. The dogma of the GPL, the dogma of open source, the dogma of WordCamps, the dogma of the WordPress way to do things in a database. Mm-hmm. Do you find that there's any have you experienced any friction going against some of that traditional kind of dogma? Like, have you ever thought, okay, well, maybe that's the way it is, but it's not the way I think it should be anymore, and I'm going to try to, push against that prevailing opinion? Have you had that experience? And if so, what is that like?
I think if you approach things rationally and respectfully, then the pushback is minimal, and it's, for the most part, ends up being healthy. And at the end of the day, we've run into scenarios where one side doesn't get their way, and you say, you know what, we'll find out whether that was the right call or the wrong call, and we go from there. And if you leave it to no hard feelings, you respect one another throughout the process, then that goes pretty smoothly. If I had to say one thing I've tried really hard to do, is it's to not burn bridges in the WordPress space. Mm-hmm. And even the ones where I have burned them or they've been burned over the years, like one of the most infamous for me was with James Farmer, where I didn't feel at fault. But then even with us, we kissed and made up 5 years later. So like, I think always, even if like something really comes down to personal feelings, always looking for a way to like let those go under the bridge, if you will, and make up later and figure out how to get past your differences is so important. And I think if you approach this ecosystem as a relational first one, rather than being such a purist or such an, I don't know, like a counter trend type of person, like if you just zoom in to those feelings and just refuse to be flexible, that does not work well in an open source ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the flexibility in your relationships and your decision making and understanding that things will happen that you don't agree with, but you roll with it and you let it go. And maybe you mix it up in the way you do your own implementations, but like nothing in the WordPress landscape and this software is that serious. To where it should get in the way of personal relationships. And I've tried really hard to maintain those personal relationships. And I'm glad that I have, because I've been here a long time now. And if I burned all the bridges that I crossed, then I wouldn't have anywhere to walk, you know?
That's a good point. I myself am certainly guilty of burning some bridges. And, please don't ever Google my name and go back and look at some of the things I've written. But in this context, I think that was a valuable lesson for me to learn, was that the tone in which you present your argument will absolutely undermine your argument validity.
Absolutely.
Because, and not to use myself as an example, but use the random track ticket or the random proposal for some change in the ecosystem. And if you can cut through the bullshit, you're like, God, that's a really good idea. We should do it that way. But then when you step back out and look at how that was delivered, you're like, wow, dude, you're not going to get anywhere with that attitude. Wow.
Absolutely.
So
no doubt about it.
I wonder how many good ideas in our ecosystem were just flat out ignored. I mean, like really good, valuable ideas that had they been adopted would have made like big differences, but were just flat out ignored or deadpan because the person delivering them did so in such a way that it was just like, nobody wants to talk to this person,
I mean, tons of ideas have gone that route, no doubt about it. And that's a natural consequence of open source relations and remote relations. Like there are things that we say online, if we're not careful, if we're not cognizant, that if we said that in person, we would be like we'd say it and then we'd go defensive, ready to get slapped in the face. Like it's fighting words if you were to actually speak them. But when you type them, you can throw it out there and there's no punch coming back at you. You just let it hang. And that can be a really toxic online environment that it takes real commitment to avoid.
Yeah, and that's certainly not unique to the WordPress community. That's everything online.
No, it's everywhere.
Everybody's anonymity. Yeah. Everybody feels super strong and powerful behind a keyboard. Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
I think actually WordPress deserves a little bit of credit for being not good enough, but better than most in terms of making an open ecosystem where we're trying to be thoughtful and open in how we embrace new ideas. But I've seen a lot of people come in guns a-blazing, saying the way WordPress does this is so stupid. You should just change it, blah, blah, blah. And they like go off firing about how it should be. And they could be totally right. But when you just come in guns blazing, like people put the shields up and they just block you right out. Like it's too bad. Good idea. You got to get out of here. No code change is worth this level of personal toxicity within the ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, so the moral of that story, I guess, what you're sharing is, flies with honey versus vinegar. How you approach something to try to get your change set or your commit accepted really goes a long way. Just how you package it.
Absolutely. 100%. And I think that's from a business perspective too. Like if you wanted to come in and figure out like, how am I going to dominate the WordPress landscape as a business? Let's use Google as our example because they're big enough to pick on from any perspective. Like if Google says, you know what, WordPress has a big percentage of the web. How can we come in and have a piece of that pie and figure out how to make it better for Google? you know what you're going to do is you're going to come in and you're going to be nice. You're going to hire
Mm-hmm.
people. You're going to throw millions of dollars at it, ungodly amounts of money relative to what the ecosystem's used to.
Yep.
And you're going to trap the flies with honey, like you just said. And strategically, that's what you were going to do. Whether your intentions are good or evil, you'll approach it in the exact same way. And that's a lot harder to fight off. But if your reasoning was to come in and like change things, that's a
Yep.
really effective way to do it. I'm not trying to say Google is trying to be evil with their contributions to WordPress, but they have their own ends in mind. Like they have business goals with what they do.
Absolutely. I think Google, GoDaddy, the EIG conglomerate, Automatic, a few
Envato.
others. Yeah, a few others. They have the purse. They have the money, and they have enough stake in the game that if any one of them or any two of them want to team up and want to push the project or the ecosystem in a certain direction, they certainly can. And if they do it with smiles on their face, no one's going to be the wiser. And that's just kind of it's just what comes with playing in an ecosystem when you have a half dozen or a dozen huge, dominant, well-funded players.
Yeah, and I don't think it has to be a bad thing. But at the end of the day, the importance of it being an open source ecosystem is why it's successful.
Mm-hmm.
Like WordPress is not successful because of Automatic. It's certainly successful because of a lot of what Matt Mullenweg has done as the leader of the project, but not because of Automatic, the organization. Now, has it benefited as a piece of software because of Automatic, the organization? Absolutely. They have committed dozens of people for 10 years. Like that's an incredible financial sum that they've committed to building tools that are good for both WordPress.com and for WordPress, the project.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you need to find this symbiosis. But if that symbiosis gets out of whack, like if something looks like it's done because it's good for Automatic, but it's not good for WordPress, or if it's good for GoDaddy, but it's not good for WordPress, or if it's good for Google, but it's not good for WordPress, then you put strain on that good-natured relationship, and that becomes a challenge, and it becomes the responsibility of all the open source contributors to be able to identify, hey, this isn't good for WordPress, and what's our governance look like in that scenario to be able to come to conclusion. And if you can't come to conclusion, that's where the real threats to the long-term viability of the project come into play, in my mind, because this is not near as valuable of a platform for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years if a single person or organization just has their way with it with every little decision when it's not good for the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Short term, it would be very beneficial, but long term, they'd essentially be knocking the pillars out of their own building.
That's right. Absolutely. And to be fair, I think Matt Mullenweg absolutely knows that from at least his perspective. In terms of the other business entities that have a significant stake in WordPress and a big ability and capacity to make change, I don't 100% know. Like I don't know what the biggest decision makers at GoDaddy, what they truly think about or care with the WordPress project. Yet they can make changes to what percentage. Do you know what percentage of websites GoDaddy hosts? Probably like, I don't know, 15%.
Enough.
Yeah, enough to where if they make a like evil change, if you will, like it's significant and it means something and it matters. And I don't know whether they would ever do that or not. Now I know they employ some really good people, so that's what you always want to see. You want to see your really good people going to work for those places because you're looking to the good people within an organization to bring integrity to the organization.
Yeah, so I love that idea. In practice at scale, that can be very hard. I had the opportunity at some point in my career to work for a large company like that. And I was not naive enough to think that me at some level down here would have any influence on the actions up here. And so while there's some very smart people working on the WordPress aspect of this company, it's $1 billion organization. Their bottom line is to drive shareholder value. I mean, at the worst, maybe someone like Aaron Campbell can kind of like not commit something. But at the end of the day, it's either he quits or he does what he's told. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but depending on the organization, I think that good people with a pretty solid understanding of the WordPress space are higher up than people that are heavily involved WordPress folks who have some particular role. Like, Aaron actually is doing a lot with WordPress over at GoDaddy now. But at GoDaddy, for example, it runs up to Gabe Mays, who is very knowledgeable about the WordPress ecosystem and what is the ethos of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And, he reports to the executive team directly. So that's great. I wish every corporate infrastructure was as nice as GoDaddy's. I don't have significant fear that GoDaddy will do those things that were a threat.
And to be clear, I was trying to use a faceless evil company example there, not GoDaddy in particular, because Aaron's a wonderful man. I know Gabe, he'll be at Pressnomics in a couple of weeks. He's a wonderful guy too. And I believe all
you got to use somebody as your example. And we know enough people there. They know they know that we know that they're all right.
Yeah. So let's wind down here in the next 5-10 minutes. And I want to shift gears totally. We've had a great conversation with WordPress. That's awesome. You, sir, are a recent father. Myself am a recent father. My kids just started second grade and kindergarten Monday.
Congrats.
Let's talk, dude. We're dads. We got work responsibilities. We have spousal responsibilities. It's hard to get everything done. I don't know about you, but sometimes it just doesn't seem like there's enough hours in the day to work, to be a good dad, to spend time with my wife, let alone just get some alone time. How are you managing work-life balance, with small children in the house? What's that feel like to you?
Yeah, so I have a 4-year-old and a brand new 2-year-old. Wow. So it's been a journey, and a lot has changed in the way that I handle things. The way I got into the WordPress space was actually a total like nights and weekends type of thing while I was doing other work. And actually I was traveling a lot, so I would do WordPress stuff at night in a hotel. And even when I was home, and before I got into like full-time WordPress, but even once I got into full-time WordPress, I was doing post status nights and weekends, and I always called it, when I'm with my wife, I always called it like 10 to 2 time, like 10 PM to 2 AM, because she's an early riser. She works early. And
say hi to Brian's dog, everyone.
That's my dog. UPS just came. So my wife is an early riser, and I would always get my work done at like 10 PM, and I would stay up until 2 AM. I can't do that anymore.
Yep.
With the kids, like I just had to give that time up, and I had to figure out how do I fit everything in the normal routine of things.
Mm-hmm. We're just going to pause and then we'll edit this out.
Yeah. Sorry. I meant to tell you but the mailman came right when we were starting. So I thought all my knocks were done, but nope.
Yeah.
Lucy! We can start that over. Come here. I always have to give that warning to people when I'm recording.
Oh, no worries.
All right.
Okay, so
you want me to kick back to being a dad?
Yeah, as you were saying, your dog is very vocal, but as you were saying, you had to rebalance your kind of nights, weekends around the new schedule of the baby.
Yeah, I had to figure out like how can I do the stuff that I was doing, but without that like late evening time where I used to be able to really knock out what I had to do in the day. And I always have considered the daytime, like I try to give myself the wiggle room to go explore conversations, especially doing post status where it's so communicative. Like I don't get a story or something interesting to write about or talk about unless I go talk to people. So I need that time to like wiggle into a chat. And then like when you got to get the business done or the administrative stuff done, I would get a lot of that done at night when it was less of those disturbances. So now it's like, how do I freaking fit all that into the regular day? And that's been a challenge for sure.
I'll tell you something. My first son was born in 2012, and Pagely was 2 full-time employees and 2 contractors. And so we had a newborn. I was basically development and DevOps for the entire company. And, it was madness. It was just pure madness. I'd help Sally uh, nurse and get the baby settled. And then I'd go try to work for an hour and then have to go get the baby back up for a nap or whatnot. And then, finally get everybody to sleep about 9, 10 o'clock. And then I start working and then just exhausted. Baby gets up, got to feed him. And I don't know how we made it through that year. What we finally ended up doing was we brought a nanny into the house to be with us while we worked and kind of assist with the baby. This economy, I don't know how parents did it in the old days, because it's the expectation now that both parents are working, both parents are co-parenting, and yet how do you raise children?
Yeah. Well, we send ours to daycare because we ran into the same problem. And, some people say like, okay, well, you're working at home. Why don't you just keep the kids at home with you? And I'm like, are you crazy? Have you ever had kids in your house full time? Do you know what it's like to work? And I know people in the WordPress space that do that. And like, I am in awe of what they do. Sarah Gooding, who my frenemy at WP Tavern, her kids don't go to daycare. She does a ton with their kids, her and Marion both, and full time right in the tavern. She's like squeezing it into all sorts of random times. And I admire people that can do that because they're saving thousands of dollars per month.
Childcare is so expensive.
It's so expensive.
Yeah. So Sally and I worked from home and we had the nanny, and up until about 2 years ago. So I had a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. Finally, I was like, okay, I need to go like full time back into the company and really focus and grow with what we're doing. So I got an office. Like, I'm in my office 8 minutes from my house, because especially during the summer, the kids are older now and it's a lot easier. But during the summer, you still can't get anything done if they're in the house. So you can't work and be a parent at the same time. And I wish there was a way we could, because I love doing both. But I couldn't figure it out. So we have to actually like have separate workspaces and then separate parenting time and all that now.
I was similar actually. And for y'all, it's harder because you have 2 people working from home, or, self-employed or running your own business. Whereas with us, my wife goes to work, but it was me at the house, and I needed a break too, as a combination of having worked remotely for, I don't know, 5 years, maybe at that point, combined with working for myself, combined with the kids being born, and like my whole life was in the house in just a couple of rooms, and I just had to get out. Yeah. So I actually rented an office for 2 years. And just in the past couple of months, I decided, you know what, I think I can come back for a bit. And I've already started to realize some of the stuff that I hated, like you never really feel like you get out to go to lunch. Like you just find that for 3 weeks straight, you ate a sandwich like every day because the fridge was right there. Or my dog, who just said hello to everyone a few minutes ago, she does that now. Whereas when I had my office, even if I took her there, it was on the second story and she wasn't distracted by the UPS man. So I didn't have these extraneous noises. Or when my kids get home at like 4:45, 5 o'clock, well, I might not be done. I might not be done until 5:30, 5:45 before we really get kicking, making dinner and stuff. That last 45 minutes is tough. Whereas when I was at my office, like I could focus until the very minute I left. And then you said you had an 8-minute commute. My commute from office to home was 2 minutes by car, or I could walk like half a mile. So I loved it. But at the same time, like for me, being a one person and a couple of contractor help business, like that cost is real. And you add it on top of all these others with daycare and everything else. I'm like, I just don't know, like spending almost $1,000 a month to be able to go half a mile away from home. I didn't really want to justify it again. And I had a nice break. So I was like, I can come home and I can handle it at the house for another year or 2.
Yeah. Well, and when they're in school full time, it's a little easier. Like this is the first year we have both kids in school for a full day. And so Sally and I are like, oh, wow, this is new.
Yeah.
And one thing I learned was how to be hyper productive, because when you had no responsibility outside of the work you were working on, you could dink around in Twitter and this and that, and 8 hours would go by, and maybe you got 3 hours in on something important. Now it's like, okay, I got exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes till I got to pick up from school, and you just crush it, right? And I've just learned to focus, and I think that's like it's been good for work to have kids because it forced me to be so focused in on what needed to be done and productive.
Yeah. There's been some studies that people are like no more than 50% productive in their day on average, something like that. I totally believe that. And I think that's why when I was getting at earlier, I would have my whole day and then I would have nighttime to try to get stuff done, is because I needed the 11 or 12-hour day to get a 7 or 8-hour day of productivity. And now, like you, I have to, if I'm either not productive and I don't get as much done as I want, and then that starts to build up until I have like some makeup time where I give in and work on a weekend or a couple of nights or something, or I have to be productive. I force myself to do that and structure my time better. And that is a lesson I am learning every single day. And I don't think it'll be solved right away, but I'm still dealing with that all the time.
Yeah.
I want to go and explore those places, like go dig into the unknown. That's part of the fun of working for yourself and, doing what I do.
Yeah. The focus is always a challenge. And while I have you, let's together give a shout out to Matt Medeiros, who works for us. He just had his third son. So he's on paternity leave right now. And he's checking in with beautiful pictures of his little baby. But, congratulations to him. But wow, he's got 3 boys under 4 years of age at home now.
3 more little Medeiros is running around. What a world.
Oh, man.
I mean, that's the iTunes library is just going to be full when they come of podcasting age. It's just, you won't be able to sort them out. It's just going to be like, which Medeiros podcast are you talking about?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's kind of like the Jonas Brothers or something.
Yeah. That's great. I'm happy for him. He's got a beautiful little family.
And he just bought a sick new minivan, which I got to tease him for.
A Swagger wagon.
Yeah. Because minivans are certainly practical and they have their use, but it's the function of having the third child. Like Sally and I stopped at 2, not because we don't love children. We absolutely love our children. But from a practical standpoint, your entire life changes again when the third child's added, right? You can't sit together in an airplane row. You can't take a standard 4-door car. Obviously, you need a minivan or a big SUV. There's always the 2 pairing up to pick on the third. So, I think 2 kids or like 6 kids, but anything between 2 and 6 is chaos.
Dude, I've said that exact justification, like per reason, dozens of times in the past year as people ask us if we're going to have a third. And I'm just like, no.
Well, hey man, I want to thank you so much. This is the first podcast that I've done, but it'll show up probably number 11 or 12 in this series. But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to sit down and catch up with me and let everybody know out there where they can find you, Mr. Krogsgaard.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. They can go to poststatus.com. That's the website where I do WordPress news and community stuff. If you want continuous education, post a job, that kind of stuff, you can go to PostStatus and do that. Or follow me on Twitter at Krogsgaard, where there's a periodic ranting.
All right, Brian, thank you so much, and good luck finding some of that work-life balance. And thank you again for everything you do. I just love being a part of your community at PostStatus because you kind of get the unfiltered industry side of things. Not the community side, but the industry side, which is much more interesting to me. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you again soon, bud.
All right, man. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Cheers.